Honourable member for Sturgeon River, Parkland.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. Unlike the Prime Minister and ministers across, it actually gives me no pleasure to rise to speak on the matter at hand. The invocation of the Emergencies Act earlier this week, for the first time in Canadian history, is a significant moment, and it's not a moment to be pleased about. It's a solemn moment. It's a moment where we have to ask ourselves, how did we get to the situation we're here in the first place? And when we examine the evidence of how we got to this situation, I don't think there's much for this government to be proud of. Now, the Conservatives thoughtfully considered the justifications written in law and given by this government for the enacting of the Emergencies Act. This government has based their justification on one provision, that a public order emergency exists throughout Canada. This claim is not supported by the evidence. Yes, we have seen border blockades in at least 4 provinces, and we have seen a persistent and now declared illegal protest in Ottawa. Before the Emergencies Act was invoked, the blockades at the borders and across Canada were lifted, or were well into the process of being lifted. So the government trying to claim credit after the fact is completely absurd. The Emergencies Act is now being used solely for the purpose of addressing the situation in Ottawa, not throughout Canada as defined by the Act. Now, a key part of the threshold for enacting these measures is that existing laws and capabilities have proven insufficient for dealing with the problem. Madam Speaker, existing laws are well equipped to deal with these situations. They were well equipped to deal with the situation at Coots, Emerson, at the Ambassador Bridge, and I submit that they are well equipped to be used here in Ottawa. The Minister of Justice said earlier, and the Minister of Emergency Preparedness, that they were required to pass this so they could requisition essential services like tow trucks. But it has been noted by many that under the criminal code, police already have the authority to requisition such services under pain of criminal sanction. That was before the Emergencies Act was brought in. So this argument that the Emergencies Act was necessary is completely absurd. I also want to note that I will be splitting my time with my honourable colleague from Regina Cabell. Now, the police already had the power to compel many of these services. The police already had the power to be coordinated with the RCMP, with the OPP, and the various police forces and national security forces throughout Canada. They have measures existing under the criminal code, mischief, intimidation, to be used against illegal protesters and blockades. Now, the government has used an argument where they're citing potential acts and threats of violence against Canadians and critical infrastructure. And this is not just any violence, they're saying. This is violence intended for the furtherance of an ideological and political objective. I'm very concerned with the language that this government is beginning to use, because that language is very similar to the language used under terrorism laws. The definition of terrorism is the use of violence to advance a political or ideological agenda. This government is using terrorism legislation against Canadian protesters. Wow. There is very little evidence that there was a serious threat to persons and critical infrastructure from these protests. There was a short-term risk. It was dealt with by law enforcement. I am very concerned, I'll address the member's question there, Ms. Heckel. I am very concerned about the situation that occurred around Coots, Alberta, where a small group of militants were arrested with firearms and with the intent to do harm. I am so thankful for law enforcement, for their efforts in taking down this very real threat. And I am so confident in our law enforcement because I know they have been planning this operation for weeks. They have likely infiltrated this group. They had a plan in place, and they had the appropriate tools and expertise to deal with this dangerous situation and defuse it before it became a very real
and dangerous situation. And the fact is, Madam Speaker, that they did this before the imposition of the Emergencies Act. Clearly, they have the tools. This undermines the government's complete argument that they are justified because there were tools that were insufficient to deal with the problems. The tools have been insufficient. The threshold has not been met. I want to address some comments that have been made by this government. The Minister of Public Safety at a press conference stated very clearly and definitively that there is a connection between that militant faction at Coutts and protesters here in Ottawa. He declined to provide any evidence to back up that assertion. He was asked repeatedly by media to back up that assertion, and he failed to back up that claim. His only evidence was citing social media posts and a general tone that has been seen in protests across Canada. Now, this government has been very quick to label protesters and anyone who would oppose their political agenda. Even before the protests began, the Prime Minister called people who oppose mandatory vaccinations, which the Prime Minister did earlier in 2021, he has called them racist, misogynist, among other epithets. Now, since the beginning of the protests, the government has sought to brand and label all protesters as fringe extremists with, quote, unacceptable views. Despite this unrelenting scrutiny and rhetoric, there has still been no evidence that there are violent extremists in Ottawa. In fact, if there were, I don't know how the government could be responsible in allowing us all to be here today and walk the streets of Ottawa. It undermines their whole claim. There is no evidence that there is a plot to violently overthrow the Canadian government, despite constant repetition and saying so. I remember there was a quote from a previous Liberal minister that says, if you tell a lie big enough and loudly enough, people will totally believe it. This government is constantly saying something that they do not have the evidence to back up. And I'd like to see that evidence if they have it. We deserve to see that evidence. This act was not designed and not intended to crack down on peaceful protesters, even if they are protesting illegally. We have other laws for dealing with this. The government is citing a so-called terrorist threat, but protesters in Ottawa, it's very inconvenient, it's terrible for the people of downtown Ottawa, but honking your horns does not meet the threshold of a terrorist organization, and the government knows that. Without further evidence of a violent threat, I cannot in good conscience support the invocation of this Emergency Act. But even if I were to accept that the government has met the threshold for calling the emergency powers, I would still have serious reservations about the powers that the government says they need to deal with this situation. If they believed there was a threat to critical infrastructure and persons, which they say they believe, I could support. If they showed evidence, I could support declaring Parliament Hill and certain sensitive areas to be a no-go zone. I could accept that we need better coordination between the RCMP and local police. But what I cannot accept is the necessity of the government undermining Section 8 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which guarantees Canadians' rights from unreasonable search and seizure to have their bank accounts frozen. The Minister of Justice on a panel last night said, if you are part of a so-called pro-Trump organization, you should be worried. I think all Canadians should be worried when a Minister of Justice threatens people because of their political views. That is not the Canada that any of us want to see, and it's unacceptable, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, throughout this debate, which we are going to be having over the next number of days, Canadians will know that their official opposition is alive and well. We are prepared to stand up for Canadians' rights. We are prepared to hold this government accountable. We're going to keep fighting. We're not going to stop standing up for Canadians' rights and freedoms. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Comments.